Widowed grandma raised her grandchildren with tears until the widowed farmer came with chickens, nails, and a request. Imagine a 65-year-old woman with calloused hands and a broken heart trying to raise 3 orphaned grandchildren in a cabin that seemed to collapse with every storm in the Arizona desert. Dorothy "Dot" McBride no longer knew where to turn when the bills piled up, when the roof leaked, and when neighbors whispered that she should give the children to foster care. Her tears fell silently every night as she mended clothes by candlelight, praying for God to give her strength for another day. What she didn't imagine was that her prayers were about to be answered in a way that would change not only her life, but also the heart of a man who had lost everything and now held a proposal that would transform the destiny of an entire family. In the small town of Copper Ridge, Arizona, where the scorching sun seemed to drain hope along with the humidity, Dorothy McBride had become a figure known for her silent struggle and unwavering dignity. At 65, she had survived the loss of her husband in a storm 5 years earlier and now faced the most difficult challenge of her life: raising 12-year-old Tommy, 9-year-old Sarah, and 6-year-old Ben alone, after her only son and daughter-in-law were lost in an epidemic that swept through the region like an invisible plague. Dorothy looked at those 3 little faces that depended on her for everything and felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, knowing that her love for them might not be enough to keep them safe and fed. Share this story to reach further. Subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. Now let me tell you a story that will touch your heart about how a simple act of kindness can turn tears into smiles and loneliness into family. Dorothy McBride woke every morning at 5, not because she wanted to, but because the weight of her responsibilities prevented her from sleeping any longer. She rose from the narrow bed she shared with little Sarah, careful not to wake the girl who had spent the night coughing from the leaky roof she couldn't fix. Dorothy walked barefoot across the cold wooden floor to the tiny kitchen, where she lit the wood stove with the last bits of wood she'd managed to gather the day before. Breakfast was always the same: watery oatmeal when there was oatmeal, or just sugared water and a slice of stale bread that she softened in the sweet liquid so the children could eat. The cabin where they lived had only 2 rooms: a bedroom she shared with Sarah and a living room that served as kitchen, dining room, and bedroom for Tommy and Ben. The roof was in terrible condition, with loose shingles that flew off in any strong wind, and the windows had cracked panes that she had covered with scraps of fabric to try to keep the cold out. Dorothy looked around her humble abode every morning and felt her heart sink, knowing that this was not the life she wanted to provide for her grandchildren, but it was all she could provide with the small pension she received and the occasional sewing jobs she could find in town. The children were the only reason Dorothy kept fighting. Tommy, the oldest, tried to be the man of the house, helping with heavy chores and taking care of his younger siblings when Dorothy had to work. Sarah was a sweet, studious girl who dreamed of being a teacher, but who often came home from school red-eyed because the other children made fun of her patched clothes and meager lunch. Ben, the youngest, was a cheerful child despite everything, but Dorothy noticed how enviously he looked at the other children who had new toys and nice clothes, and it broke her heart. Dorothy worked as a seamstress for a few families in town, but her pay was irregular and insufficient. She spent hours hunched over her ancient sewing machine, which she only used when she was in a good mood, mending clothes, making small adjustments, and occasionally sewing a new piece when a local high society lady needed something special. Her hands were always sore from the needle pricks, her eyes burned from straining in the dim candlelight, and her back ached from the long hours sitting in an uncomfortable chair. But Dorothy never complained, because she knew that every penny she earned was crucial to keeping her children fed and clothed. Nights were the hardest time for Dorothy. After the children were asleep, she would sit on the cabin porch, looking up at the starry Arizona sky, and let the tears flow freely. She wept for the life her grandchildren deserved, for the uncertain future that awaited them, for the loneliness she felt carrying all that weight alone. Dorothy talked to the photograph of her husband in her apron pocket, asking for advice he could no longer give, begging for strength she couldn't find. "John," she whispered to the faded image, "I don't know how much longer I can take care of them alone. Help me be strong for one more day." Dorothy's financial situation was becoming desperate. Bills were piling up in a drawer she avoided opening because she knew she couldn't pay them. The cabin's owner had raised the rent, claiming he needed renovations, but Dorothy knew he just wanted to get rid of her and the children. The local grocery store had cut off her credit after she couldn't pay last month's bill, and the town doctor had made it clear he would no longer offer free consultations. Dorothy felt like she was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and at any moment she could fall and take her grandchildren with her. During the long winter days, when the sewing slowed and the bills continued to pile up, Dorothy often wondered if it wouldn't be better for everyone if she gave the children to the Phoenix orphanage. The thought tortured her, but she knew that at the orphanage they would have regular food, proper clothing, and a better education than she could offer. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin and the children shivered beneath their thin blankets, Dorothy wondered if her love for them was selfish, if she wasn't hurting their chances for a better life by being unable to part with them. Tommy had grown up too fast for his age, taking on responsibilities no 12-year-old should have. He woke up before his grandmother to fetch firewood, helped prepare breakfast, and took care of his younger siblings when Dorothy had to work in town. Dorothy saw a precocious maturity in the boy's eyes that saddened her deeply, because she knew he was losing his childhood to help his family survive. "Grandma," Tommy said one night, hugging her on the porch, "I'll grow up soon and get a real job. Then you won't have to worry about anything anymore." Ooh. Dorothy kissed her grandson's forehead, her heart breaking at the realization that he was already planning to sacrifice his own dreams for the family. Sarah was a sensitive girl who felt deeply about her family's poverty. She often came home from school silent, and Dorothy knew she was suffering from the inevitable comparisons with other children. She had stopped mentioning her dreams of becoming a teacher, as if she had understood that dreams were luxuries they could not afford. Dorothy one day found a drawing Sarah had made, showing a happy family in a large house, with a garden full of flowers and a table laden with food. In the corner of the paper, written in the girl's careful handwriting, was, "My dream for Grandma." Dorothy put the drawing away and cried for hours, knowing she was failing to give her granddaughter everything she deserved. Little Ben worried Dorothy the most. At 6, he still didn't fully understand why they had less than other families, but Dorothy could tell he was starting to ask difficult questions. "Why does our house make noise when it's windy, Grandma?" he asked one stormy night. "Why don't we have toys like the other boys?" Dorothy tried to explain in a way he could understand, but it was hard to find words that didn't sound like excuses. She saw Ben's fascination with the other children at church, who had new clothes and elaborate snacks, and knew he would soon begin to feel the weight of difference too. The Copper Ridge community was small, and everyone knew Dorothy's plight. Some people were genuinely kind, offering occasional help or extra work, but others treated her with the condescending pity she detested. Dorothy heard the whispers in the grocery store. Poor Dot. Trying to raise 3 children alone at that age. She should give them up to the orphanage. It would be better for everyone. It's not fair to the children, growing up in poverty like that. Each comment was like a stab to her pride, but Dorothy held her head high, greeted everyone politely, and moved on, knowing that showing weakness would only give the gossips more ammunition. The local church was one of Dorothy's only refuges. Every Sunday, she would put on her best clothes, which weren't much better than everyone else's, carefully comb the children's hair, and walk the 2 miles to the small Copper Ridge Methodist Church. There, she found temporary peace, singing hymns she remembered from her youth and praying for strength to carry on. Pastor Johnson was a kind man who always had words of encouragement, But Dorothy knew he was also concerned about the family's situation. He had discreetly mentioned aid programs in larger cities, but Dorothy didn't want to be seen as a beggar, even if it meant continuing to struggle alone against seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Walter Thompson had watched the McBride family from afar for months, his heart heavy with an empathy he knew all too well. At 58, Walter was a man of few words, but keen observation, and his own experience with loss and hardship had made him sensitive to the silent suffering of others. He lived on a prosperous farm, about 10 miles from Copper Ridge, where he raised cattle and chickens and had earned a reputation as an honest and hard-working man, but also as someone who preferred solitude to social companionship. Walter had lost his wife, Martha, to a complicated birth 3 years earlier, along with the son they had longed for, and since then he had isolated himself from the world, finding solace only in hard work and the rigorous routine of the farm. Around town, Walter was known as the quiet farmer, who occasionally dropped by to buy supplies, always polite but reserved, paying his bills on time and leaving without much conversation. He had noticed Dorothy and the children at church, quietly observing how she struggled to maintain her dignity despite obvious hardships. Walter recognized in Dorothy's eyes the same look he saw in the mirror, the look of someone who had lost too much and now struggled to find purpose in life. He admired her determination, her way of holding her head high even when it was clear she was facing enormous difficulties. Walter had grown up on a farm, the son of parents who taught him that hard work and compassion were the foundations of a life well lived. He had married Martha when they were both 25, and together they had built a prosperous and happy life on the farm he had inherited from his father. They had tried for many years to have children, and when Martha finally became pregnant, Walter felt like the most blessed man in the world. He had transformed one of the house's bedrooms into the perfect nursery, purchased a handmade crib, and spent months planning how to teach his son all about country life. The loss of Martha and the baby had devastated Walter, and he had closed the nursery, putting the keys in a drawer he never opened again. Walter's farm was prosperous, but he felt all that prosperity was empty without someone to share it with. He had hundreds of chickens that laid eggs he could barely eat, cows that provided enough milk for a large family, and a garden that produced an abundance of vegetables. Walter often wondered why God had given him so much when he had no one to care for it, while families like Dorothy's struggled to survive. He had begun observing the McBride cabin during his trips to town, noticing the crumbling roof, the broken fence, the obvious signs that the family was facing hardships beyond what any one person should have to endure alone. For weeks, Walter struggled internally with the desire to help and the fear of becoming emotionally involved again. He knew his life had become safe in solitude, where there was no risk of losing someone he loved, but he also knew he was wasting the opportunity to do good that was within his reach. Walter began to plan a way to offer help without hurting Dorothy's pride, because he recognized in her the same pride he possessed. He knew she wouldn't accept charity, but perhaps she would welcome a partnership, an arrangement that would benefit both parties. One night, while Walter was tending the chickens in the coop, he had an idea that made his heart race for the first time in years. He looked at the dozens of hens laying eggs daily, thought about the nails and lumber he had in abundance in the barn, and began to form a plan that could change the lives of everyone involved. Walter stayed up all night, refining the idea, thinking through every detail, preparing to do something that would require courage he hadn't exercised in a long time. He knew he was about to step outside his comfort zone, but he also knew that some moments in life require us to make choices that define who we truly are. On a cool March morning, Walter loaded his wagon with meticulous care. A dozen caged laying hens, several bags of nails of various sizes, high-quality wooden planks, and tools he had personally selected. He put on his best shirt, combed his graying hair with unusual care, and headed for the McBride cabin, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. Walter had mentally rehearsed his proposal dozens of times, but he knew the real moment would be different, that he would have to find the right words to convince Dorothy to accept his help without making her feel diminished or dependent. Dorothy was hanging laundry on the makeshift clothesline when she saw the wagon approaching. She didn't immediately recognize the quiet, church-going farmer, but she noticed he seemed nervous, fiddling with his hat as he approached. "Good morning, Mrs. McBride," Walter said, stepping down from the wagon with careful movements. "I'm Walter Thompson. I have a farm nearby. I'd like to talk to you about a proposal that might interest us both." Dorothy dried her hands on her apron, intrigued by the man's formality and the mysterious nature of his visit. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How can I help you?" Walter took a deep breath and began to explain his idea with a sincerity that impressed Dorothy. "Mrs. McBride, I have a thriving farm, but I'm a lone man. I have too many chickens, too many eggs to produce, and carpentry skills I haven't put to good use. At the same time, I see you have a beautiful family, but you're facing difficulties anyone would struggle with." He paused, watching Dorothy's expression, which had become wary. "I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I'm proposing a partnership that would benefit us all." Dorothy crossed her arms, her dignity wounded by the implicit suggestion that she needed help. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your concern, but my family and I are fine. We don't need—" Walter interrupted her gently, raising his hand. "Please, let me explain fully before I decide. I propose providing laying hens and materials to repair your house in exchange for occasional housekeeping and company at meals. I'm not asking you to take care of me out of pity, but because I'm a lonely man who misses having family around the table." The honesty in his voice made Dorothy pause and really consider his words. The children had gathered around during the conversation, curious about the visitor and impressed by the chickens in the wagon. Tommy stared fascinated at the tools. Sarah watched the chickens with bright eyes, and Ben had hidden behind his grandmother's skirt, spying on the kind stranger. Walter bent down to Ben's level, offering a smile he rarely used. "Hello, little one. Would you like to see the chickens up close?" Ben nodded shyly, and Walter picked him up and carried him to the wagon. "These are special chickens. They lay eggs every day, and if you take good care of them, they might become your friends." Dorothy watched the interaction between Walter and Ben, noticing how gentle and patient the man was with the child. She also saw how Tommy approached the tools reverently, and how Sarah whispered something about fresh eggs every day to herself. Dorothy realized that Walter had deliberately made his proposal in front of the children, knowing it would be harder for her to refuse when he saw their genuine interest. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "your offer is generous, but how can I be sure I won't owe you more than I can afford? I don't have much to offer beyond basic housework." Walter set Ben down and turned to Dorothy with a serious expression. "Mrs. McBride, I'll be completely honest with you. I lost my wife and son 3 years ago, and I've been living like a ghost ever since. My house is big and empty. My table always has room for only one person, and sometimes I go entire days without speaking to anyone. I'm not offering help out of pity, but because I need you as much as you need me. A home needs children's laughter, a table needs family, and a man needs purpose beyond just survival." His words were spoken with such sincerity that Dorothy felt tears well up in her eyes. Dorothy stared at Walter Thompson for a long moment, seeing in his eyes a pain she recognized perfectly, the pain of someone who had lost everything they loved most in life. She watched how he interacted with the children, with a natural kindness that could not be faked, and realized that his proposal came from a place of genuine mutual need, not condescending pity. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, "I accept your proposal, but on one condition. This must be a real partnership where both sides contribute equally. I do not accept charity, but I can accept a friendship based on mutual assistance." Walter felt such relief that he almost knelt on the spot, but instead he simply nodded respectfully, extending his hand to seal the deal. The first thing Walter did was examine the cabin's roof, and what he saw made his heart sink. The shingles were loose. There were holes that let in rain, and the wooden structure was beginning to rot in places. "This can't wait," he muttered to himself, mentally calculating the materials needed for a complete renovation. Dorothy watched him climb a makeshift ladder, noting how he examined every detail with the care of a seasoned craftsman. "Mr. Thompson," she called from below, "how long do you think it will take to fix it?" Walter climbed down and looked at her with an expression that mixed determination and compassion. "I'll do more than fix it, Dorothy. I'll make this house a safe home for your children." For the next few weeks, Walter appeared every morning just after sunrise, carrying tools and materials. He worked quietly, but with a precision that impressed Dorothy, removing old shingles, replacing rotted beams, reinforcing the structure that had deteriorated over the years. Tommy became his unofficial assistant, passing tools, holding boards, and asking incessant questions about carpentry. "Mr. Walter," the boy asked one day, "how did you learn to do all this?" Walter stopped hammering and looked at the boy fondly. "My father taught me when I was your age. He said a man who knows how to work with his hands will never go hungry." Sarah had taken on the responsibility of the chickens with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. She developed a morning routine of feeding them, cleaning the makeshift coop Walter had built, and collecting the eggs with reverent care. "Grandma, look at all the eggs today," she would exclaim every morning, rushing into the kitchen with a basket full. Dorothy watched her granddaughter with tears in her eyes, seeing how the responsibility had given her a sense of purpose and pride she hadn't felt in a long time. Little Ben had become Walter's shadow, following him everywhere, asking questions about every tool, every technique, every construction decision. The change in the family dynamic was visible to everyone in the community. The children walked to school with more confidence. Tommy talked excitedly about the carpentry lessons he was learning, and Sarah had once again mentioned her dreams of becoming a teacher. Dorothy felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders, not only by the practical help, but by the feeling that she was no longer alone in the world. She prepared meals for Walter every day, and slowly their lunch conversations became more personal, more intimate, with both sharing stories from their past lives. Walter found in Dorothy a companion he hadn't realized how much he'd missed. She was an intelligent woman with strong opinions on everything from politics to religion, and he found himself eagerly awaiting the moments they could talk while she sewed and he worked on the porch. "Dorothy," he said one afternoon as she mended Tommy's shirt, "it's been a long time since I heard laughter in a house. I've forgotten how comforting it is." Dorothy looked at him with a smile that transformed her face, making it younger and more radiant. "Walter, it's been a long time since I felt safe. I've forgotten how good it is to sleep without worrying about whether the roof will hold up in the next storm." 3 months later, the McBride cabin had become a cozy, safe home. Walter had not only repaired the roof, but also expanded the structure, adding an extra bedroom and a covered porch where the children could play even when it rained. The chicken coop had become a little kingdom for Sarah, who now had 20 chickens and sold eggs to neighbors, contributing to the family income. Dorothy had resumed her sewing with renewed vigor now that she had a well-lit house and a suitable space to work. Their partnership had become something much deeper than either had initially imagined. Walter had become part of the family's daily routine. He arrived every morning for breakfast, helped Tommy with the heavier chores, played with Ben in the yard, and spent the afternoons chatting with Dorothy while she worked. The children had taken to calling him Uncle Walter, a title he carried with pride and affection. Dorothy noticed how he looked at the family with an expression of contentment she hadn't seen at the beginning of their partnership, as if he had finally found a purpose he had been searching for years. One Sunday afternoon, after they returned from church together, a tradition that had developed naturally over the months, Walter asked to speak with Dorothy alone. They sat on the new porch, watching the children play in the yard, and Walter seemed more nervous than Dorothy had seen him since day one. "Dorothy," he began, fiddling with the hat he held in his hands, These last few months have been the happiest I've had in years. Watching you with the children, being part of this family, has made me realize something I hadn't expected. Dorothy felt her heart race, sensing the conversation was taking a turn that could change everything between them. "I've fallen in love," Walter continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Not just with you, Dorothy, but with this family, with this life we've built together. I don't want to go home to my empty house every night anymore. I don't want to spend Sundays alone anymore without the sound of children's laughter." He paused, taking a deep breath, and Dorothy saw tears shining in his eyes. "I'm asking you to marry me, not out of convenience, not out of practical necessity, but because I love you and these children, and I want to spend the rest of my life caring for you the way you cared for me." Dorothy felt the world spin around her. She had realized that her feelings for Walter had evolved beyond gratitude and friendship, but she hadn't allowed herself to dream that he might feel the same. "Walter," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "are you sure? You know I'm not in the prime of life anymore, and these children will demand a lot from you for years to come." Walter moved closer to her, taking her calloused hands in his. "Dorothy, I don't want the prime of life. I want autumn, with all its wisdom and mature beauty. I want to be a grandfather to these children. I want to teach Tommy everything about carpentry. I want to see Sarah graduate as a teacher. I want to play with Ben until he grows up." The children had stopped playing and approached the porch. Sensing something important was happening, Tommy was the first to speak. "Uncle Walter, are you going to be our real grandfather?" Walter smiled, looking at the boy with all the love that had grown in his heart. "If your grandmother agrees, and if you want, I would love to be your grandfather." Sarah clapped her hands happily, and Ben ran to climb into Walter's lap, hugging him with the strength of a child who finally felt completely safe. Dorothy looked at the scene, at the man who had arrived with chickens and nails and was now surrounded by his grandchildren, beaming with happiness, and knew there could only be one answer. "Yes," Dorothy said, her voice strong and clear, "I do marry you, Walter Thompson, not just because you saved us, but because you have become a part of us, and I can no longer imagine our lives without you." The kiss they shared was witnessed by 3 children who finally understood that family is not just about blood, but about choice, love, and commitment. Walter had arrived with chickens, nails, and a request, but what he really brought was the hope that it is never too late to start a new life, to find a new family, to discover that love can blossom even after the most devastating loss. And so, a simple proposal of partnership turned into the truest love 2 lonely souls could ever discover. Walter and Dorothy were married the following month in a simple ceremony at a Methodist church, surrounded by a community that had witnessed their transformation. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and redemption. Share this video with anyone who needs to believe that life always reserves second chances for those who don't give up on love. Leave a comment below with the moment in the story that touched you most. Thank you for being part of this journey of discovery and familial love.